Nick probably spent a lot of the morning talking about kind of the how of 360, and you guys are going to get a lot today of the how of 360. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the kind of the what and the why. Specifically, what is happening inside someone's brain and physiology and inner life while they're watching VR content, or I want to kind of I think it's important to use proper language, and I think sort of watching VR content doesn't really get to it. I think the more accurate term is experiencing the simulated reality that you have authored for them. So we're going to sort of get into what is happening and why it's important that we are conscious of that as creators. So this talk is called The Upward Spiral: Conscious Content Creation in Virtual Reality. So I really love bacon. I'll eat it every time it's offered to me. Doesn't matter where I am, if it fell on the floor, what it's wrapped in or wrapped on. Back in January, I was at Sundance and I watched this piece about a VR piece, or rather engaged with a simulated reality that someone had created for me. It was a 360 video about a slaughterhouse. And after I watched that video, I did not eat pork or bacon for approximately 6 or 7 weeks. Now, I'm not like an animal rights activist. I don't have any ethical problems with killing animals. And yet, after I watched this 5-minute video, I had a visceral, immediate negative reaction anytime I was offered pork or bacon. You know, I had seen graphic videos about the cruelty of the meat industry before, yet here I was standing in the grocery aisle, staring at a pack of bacon before putting it back in the grocery store refrigerator. Something really fundamental had changed, and I wanted to understand why. So, you know, I knew that VR was more than a new piece of tech, a new medium, or even a new platform, that it operates on a much more profound level of sensory deprivation and sensory replacement, and physically affects the same parts of the brain as a lived experience rather than the parts of the brain that get affected by a book or a film. Still, none of that explained why I was standing there, you know, frozen in the cold food aisle. And this sent me down a rabbit hole in which I discovered 4 things that helped me make sense of why this had happened, and that's what I'm going to share with you today. So they are, number 1, the theory that we may already all be living inside a simulated reality. Number 2, how our senses lie to us about the nature of the physical world. Number 3, how our consciousness is defined by our relationships. And number 4, what this all means to those of us who create and consume VR content. So the first is the simulation argument. The idea that we may all be living inside a simulated reality is not anything new. It is something that ancient civilizations from the Maya in North America to Aboriginal Australians carried as a central part of their cosmology. And it's also a basic element in religions in both the East and the West, and a popular theme in science fiction. You've all seen The Matrix. So what is new is that this idea has recently gained traction from traditionally materialist science. In 2003, you guys might know about this, but Nick Bostrom put forward the Bostrom trilemma, which claims that one of the following things must be true. Number 1, we live in a universe in which simulations are impossible. So this is the idea that all civilizations that develop at our pace will go extinct before they create the technology to enable them to create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality. We don't know that this isn't happening, right? Because we're like almost there, and this is the big joke in VR that, you know, it's okay, VR sucks right now, you know, that it's getting better. So we don't yet have simulations that are completely indistinguishable from reality, but we are approaching, we're getting pretty close at this point. But you know, we don't know. We might still go extinct before we reach that. So the second part of the trilemma is we live in a universe in which simulations are uninteresting. It's basically, civilizations that have the ability to create realistic simulations would be uninterested in doing so. And the third piece of this, and this is just kind of the statistical probability, we live in a simulated reality. And recently this idea got a lot of press. I don't know if you saw it, but Elon Musk at a TechCrunch event stated that he believes the chances of us living in the base reality to be 1 in a billion. And he says that it's far more likely that we live in a simulation. He also believes, this was his Twitter feed after that. So this says Elon Musk thinks we all live in a video game, so what if we do? So he also believes that even if we do live in a giant simulation, that it doesn't really matter. As long as the deception of our senses is perfect, there should be no discernible difference between consequences here in this simulation and consequences in our base reality. I beg to differ. I argue that it does matter, because I think simulations, or the idea of being inside a simulation, cause 2 very powerful and important responses in people. The first is that they feel free to experiment through play. And the second is that they have the agency to change the rules under which they live. And I think you see this at festivals. You can see this anytime someone puts on a mask. So, while materialist science looks outside for proof of the simulation argument, assuming that we live in a sort of, fishbowl that beyond some discrete border, there lies another domain from which we in our universe have been created, I want to offer that the simulation we call reality is caused by the filtering of our sensory perception combined with the social nature through which we build our embodied consciousness, rather than as a condition of the material world. So our simulated reality exists instead of our simulated reality existing out there, it exists up here. Okay, so this is the interactive part. Everybody close your eyes. And just let it settle for a second. Okay, now open them. Okay, so in that second when you open your eyes, you just fired up 1/3 of your cerebral cortex, activating billions of neurons and trillions of synapses, and basically starting the most advanced and realistic reality engine ever created. So a popular assumption about sensory input is that there's an objectively true 3-dimensional world out there that our senses simply capture and play back, right? And this is mostly so that we don't die from all the stuff in the world that's trying to constantly kill us. And we suppose that evolution favored those who could see the world most accurately, since they were able to stay alive long enough to have kids. And since we are the children of these ancient supermen, we must also see the world accurately, right? So how many people think this is a reasonable assumption? Okay, cool, a few of you. Well, it turns out that almost none of that is actually true. And the reason for this is that as we evolved, natural selection didn't care about truth or accuracy, only survival and fitness. And if any of you are trying to raise venture capital, you probably have some insight as to what I'm saying here. Basically, it turns out that an organism who sees reality as it actually is has no greater chance of survival than an organism of equal complexity whose perception is tuned solely to its own fitness. So we're all like Goldilocks. Our ideal conditions exist on a bell curve. So too little water, we die of dehydration. Too much water, we drown. So an organism that can perceive the entire truth about water, its presence in the air, its texture, color, volume, weight, etc., holds little to no advantage over an organism of equal complexity that perceives helpful water as a green blob and unhelpful water as a red blob. So it doesn't matter to natural selection that the organism who can perceive the truth about water may have a richer, more layered experience of the world than Blobby. Both are equally likely to pass their genes to the next generation. And in fact, that it could be argued that Blobby has the advantage. Because her perception is heavily filtered, she has less information to sort through when making choices critical to her survival. She's not wasting her time considering a beautiful cloud of water vapor hanging in the air. Instead, she's moving out of the way of the tiger who's trying to eat the guy who is. This type of sensory filtering is most visually evident in late 20th century films, in the movie The Predator. And it turns out we have a lot more in common with Blobby or the Predator, because rather than seeing the world as it really is, we see just enough of the world to give us the clues we need to fill in the blanks from an existing inventory of mental models in a game of perceptual Mad Libs where our brains automatically fill in the blanks before we even realize that they're there. So have you ever had this happen to you, right? You see an object out of the corner of your eye, you can't quite figure out what it is. You're at your house, you're like, that's weird. There's something in my house that I don't know what it is. So you walk towards it, you start to examine it. You get filled with a sense of wonder, maybe fear. And then as you examine it a little more closely, you realize, oh, it's just your toaster, or just a chair, like a shirt hanging off a chair in a weird way. And as soon as you realize what it is, that sense of wonder goes away, the fear or anxiety subsides, you get back to whatever you were doing, and you've now added a new mental model to your inventory of what shirt on chair is, right? Or toaster in sunlight is, or what have you. So this is one reason why experiences with psilocybin, LSD, and ayahuasca or DMT can be so transformative, inspiring, and also terrifying. Psychedelic trips and psychedelic substances remix this model-based inventory system, allowing us to apply it in new ways. And this disorientation can lead to both experiences of terror, sticks become snakes and you're covered in spiders, conversely experiences of awe and beauty where rock formations become gorgeous towering temples and highly organized patterns of shapes emerge in the desert floor. All this is to say is that what we accept as objective reality, physical reality, can be more accurately described as a function of mutual agreement. This is mathematically provable. Similar mechanisms are at work in our inner life. So up until recently, the popular view of consciousness came from René Descartes, who famously said, "I think, therefore I am," right? This model, the Cartesian model, it assumes that consciousness has a discrete limit and exists independently of any observer. So much like the view of the physical world that assumes that there's an objective outer reality, this model assumes that you have an objective inner being, right? And that this inner being grew inside you much the same way that a plant grows inside a pot. However, recently psychologists have put forward a new view of consciousness. And this view treats consciousness as a recursive social act rather than a solitary one. So according to this view, we learn to be aware of ourselves through other people being aware of us. And we support and maintain each other's identities through language and nonverbal communication. So rather than a plant inside a pot, the roots of ourselves are this constantly intertwining feedback loop. So the self becomes a result of a mutual mental modeling of relationships, which continue even when a person is alone, right? So in this example, Bob's model of Alice is constantly getting revised by the behavior that Alice is doing and what he knows about Alice and what he knows about other people and whatever he takes as his normal, right? And he's constantly sort of building this model of Alice. Alice at the same time is doing the same thing with Bob. This gets really, really crazy when you start thinking about romantic relationships and the ways that your existing models for romantic partners get applied to other people, and your ideals for romantic partners get applied to other people. And then you have to constantly revise that model. With your partners, they reveal themselves through continued behavior and engagement. As we move forward with this, it's not a static single thing. So you don't have one true objective self that is a singular thing that maintains its full integrity. Instead, we're all spreading out our various selves among many people, and we get simulated in their brain at various levels. So rather than a static condition, each of us have a different self for different social contexts and cohorts. So in this view of consciousness, there can never be a single objectively true self. Instead, the true self exists in between and within all these various constructs. And what ends up being the core task of being human, and something that exists largely without us really being aware of it, is the ordinary function of maintaining one's own identity and the identity of others. This means that in a very real way, you maintain my identity and I maintain yours. Whatever I imagine that you could be is what you ultimately become, and vice versa. So we literally are creating each other inside our simulated reality that's dictated by mutual agreement. What does this have to do with VR? Okay, I get it. Everything's subjective. Why does it matter? As I was doing this research, I was asking myself, how, if the very fabric of our reality, both internal and external, is a function of mutual agreement, how we landed in a world where there are 6 empty homes for every homeless American, where 40% of our food supply is thrown out while 20% of families are food insecure, and we dig poison out of the ground and vaporize it to create energy despite a giant ball of nuclear energy showering us with more energy in a day than we can use in a lifetime. And what emerges is a pattern where, because we live in a system designed to manage scarcity, we then create an artificial scarcity to adapt our lives to the needs of the system rather than vice versa. Adapting the system to manage the new abundance we've created through advancing technology. So the reason why, for most people, our world looks increasingly like this and this, instead of this, is this. So Tony Robbins calls this the cycle of success. David Kolb, it's really modeled after the work of David Kolb, who's a education specialist. Part of this is the experiential model of adult learning. Whatever action you take, and you can sort of jump into this cycle at any point, right? Whatever you believe is going to happen informs the potential actions that you will take. Out of those potential actions, you take one action, right? So your choice is already limited by your belief. You take an action, that action produces results, which then confirms or denies that belief, reinforces some set of potentials, and then causes you to take further action, right? To that point, everything we do is tied to the belief that we are acting in the best interests of our own survival, right? I think we're all reasonably healthy humans. We embrace pleasure and reject pain. But when our senses evolved, our biology never anticipated that survival would eventually be such a social act. So this is like a really kind of dumb example, but I think one we can all relate to. How many of you have ever been in a traffic jam? Okay, right? Everybody, they suck. So traffic jams are often caused by a single hurried person on the freeway following someone else too close and then having to stop short. So this causes a chain reaction where all the cars behind them have to stop short in that same spot. And then this causes sort of a buildup of anxiety with the other drivers behind them, so they all start making the same mistake, and now you have the 401 at rush hour, right? It's a total nightmare. And the solution to this is really simple. If everyone just maintains a safe following distance at a more or less constant speed and stays in their lane, we'd all be cool. There wouldn't be as many traffic jams. So the irony is that even though I know this is true and I know how to avoid it, I still make the choice that limits my ability to thrive. I have 2 mental models for getting there faster. So the sensory experience of speeding down the highway, right? And the idea of maintaining a safe following distance and constant speed. Now the problem is that the sensory experience of speeding down the highway is way more credible than the idea of keeping a safe following distance. So even though I know it's wrong, it's what I end up doing anyway. And I think what VR offers us is a way to revolutionize this cycle by offering a new kind of sensory experience, right? So imagine that now I can have a firsthand sensory experience of viewing the entire system in a way that would be unavailable to me outside of VR. I can see every other car on the highway as I'm making decisions in traffic. When I see an opening, I cut into the other lane, forcing another car to stop short. Only this time, rather than continuing on obliviously, the simulation shows me the chain reaction I've caused, and I get to have a firsthand sensory experience that I never got in real life. So all of a sudden, I've created real competition for my belief that driving erratically down the highway is better than leaving a good following distance and staying in my lane, because I finally have a competing sensory experience to back it up, right? I've created a new mental model. So again, like I said, none of these are new ideas. Our mental models come from 3 primary places. They're built from past direct experience, right? I did this before, and this is what happened. Past observed experience, I saw someone else do this before, and that's what happened to them. And cultural indoctrination, and that's, enough other people claim to have done or seen someone or something else do this before, and This is what they say happened, so I believe them. And up until now, mass media, which is a primary way that we understand the world around us, has been confined to the second and third categories. Really, with VR and AR, this is the first mass media tool that allows us to create experiences for that first category, for direct experience, which allows us access into the most critical driver of our reality engine. The overview effect is a well-documented example of the kind of cognitive shift that is possible through new sensory experience. Astronauts who firsthand see the reality of Earth and space, immediately recognize it as this tiny, fragile ball. National boundaries vanish. All sorts of international conflicts just become completely unimportant. And the need to create a planetary society that will protect our fragile ecosystem becomes both obvious and imperative. And there's already a VR company who's made it their mission to put cameras in space. It's called Space VR, so that those of us here on Earth can experience the overview effect, because they believe that it will cause the kind of rapid, radical shift which is crucial at this point to solving climate change or reversing climate change. So, this injection of new sensory experience and the resulting transformation of our inner and outer lives, this is going to happen regardless of our desire to reckon with it. It is as inevitable as the weather. But I think that by being conscious of it and by recognizing the agency and responsibility that we have as creators in this medium, my belief is that we can contribute to a real upward spiral of personal and systemic evolution at a pace and scale never before imagined. For instance, I'm a firm believer, and feel free to debate me on this if you like. I'm a firm believer that the singularity event that Ray Kurzweil imagines will happen in VR way before it happens, if ever, in the physical world. So with that in mind, I want to leave you with a few of the best practices that we've discovered at our company. These are some guidelines that we use for choosing and creating projects. Somebody brings us something to look at. This is, these are kind of the bars by which we measure it. So the first one is to successfully challenge your audience, you must first gain their trust and affinity. This is not unique to VR. They do this in film all the time, right? However, I think if you're going to ask somebody to follow you into a challenging experience, you wouldn't follow somebody down a dark alley, right, that you didn't know or trust or like. The way to do this, or a good way to do this, is to make a promise and then keep it. And you may be making a promise in your marketing material or in your image, and to do it early. Do it in the first 30 seconds, because it'll just get everybody right on board really, really fast. So the second one is create worlds that people want to stay inside. Because you have a complicit audience, it's really in your best interest to create a world that invites them to stay in and engage with it, rather than one that challenges them to be there, right? So instead of creating an environment that's unpleasant and you sort of daring them to stay there, well, they're going to leave. And as soon as they take the headset off, you're done. Your piece is over. They're not putting it back on. The third is reward disruption. People are just flat out not going to do what you tell them to do regardless, and that's a really good thing. Make sure that when they do break the rules inside the headset, that you reward their experiments. However they are able to experiment inside the headset, they'll carry that out with them into the wider world, and this is how you will start to see the most exciting and vibrant impact from your piece. Finally, make experiences as accessible as possible. The distribution platforms are still rapidly developing, and ensuring access to your content for those at every point of entry, regardless of the technological hurdles involved, is really crucial to creating VR experiences with high impact. And if you have questions on strategies for doing that, I'm happy to talk about that. So, the final thought is really that by creating previously impossible sensory experiences inside the headset, we do create de facto a new reality. And we give people a whole new sense of the world and our place in it, you know, whatever it actually is. Thank you. And if you found parts of this interesting and you want to follow up on some of that, here are the sources for a lot of the research. I thought footnoting it during the talk would be just another level of snooze, so I didn't. But you know, the various sections, I sort of laid them out in order here. Okay, great. So any questions or comments or soapbox rants? Yeah.
One of your guidelines was that create a world that can only stay inside.
Yeah.
I don't know what the light switch is.
Phobias and so on, you want to treat them. Do you have any experience with those from the educational perspective? Or
With what? I'm sorry, say that again.
you know, you want to treat a phobia, for example.
A phobia, right. Well, I mean, I would say in that case, like so say someone's afraid of spiders, right? So you don't just like stick them in a room full of spiders. You just like, hey, put the headset on, room full of spiders, you know, you take it off. You'd probably want to introduce the phobic elements more slowly, you know, put them in first like a pleasant environment that they feel comfortable in, right? So that they can get a sense of acclimation. Once they're there, you can start introducing the phobic elements slowly, carefully, so that they start from a baseline of calm. And this is kind of what I was saying with the trust and affinity thing, right? If you want somebody to follow you into a challenging experience, you know, you don't just sort of drop them right in the snake pit as soon as they get inside your experience. I've seen films do that successfully, but I think VR as a medium is different because of the complicity of the audience, the complicity that you require of the audience, right? Films and framed media implicate us, right? They sort of drag us into the conversation with them, regardless of whether or not we want to be there. I mean, there's so much like dumb shit that I know from the TV station or the TV screen at the gas station that I like have no interest in having in my brain, yet it's in my brain, right? Because that television has implicated me. I can't escape it. VR is very different. You know, someone puts on a headset, that's actually the first moment. That's the moment where the experience starts. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Timothy Leary, but he talks a lot about set and setting as very crucial elements for the psychedelic experience, and I think the same is true in VR. And part of that set and setting is how they get in the headset. And then, you know, to your point, when you're treating a phobia, exactly the same thing, set and setting, right? So if you want to show somebody that something's not dangerous, you're going to put them in a safe environment, and then bring out the thing they regard as dangerous, and then let them see that it's not, right?
Thanks.
Yeah.
If your goal is social engineering, you have to be upfront about what may happen to someone after using the same way if you took LSD. If you want to be very upfront, that I guess you can change this. But it seems virtual reality, people just pop it on and experience it. So you have to be much more upfront. It's almost like a pharmaceutical trial where you're like, this could change you for there's no reason, and we're actually trying to change you.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the whole idea of building trust and affinity, right? You build trust by being upfront about your experience, and I think that like you started to touch on it, but there are actually handbooks for dealing with people on psychedelics, and I think that a lot of those same rules apply in VR. So yeah, I think being as upfront as possible is absolutely a good idea, because again, you're not going to so the piece that I was shown about the slaughterhouse, right, was incredibly challenging. However, when I got into the experience, I wasn't right at the farm. And I don't know, you can probably look this piece up. It's by a company called Condition 1, and I forget the title of it, but if you look up Condition 1 Slaughterhouse, and this so I put the headset on, and the first thing I see is a very soft-voiced man, very compassionate. I can tell he's like looking me in the eyes, and he's telling me, I'm about to take you through a really challenging experience. And we're sitting in a living room in a house, you know? It's a very comfortable place, you know? And he says, I'm gonna take you on a very challenging experience, but I think it's important that you see this, right? And I was watching it, and the whole time I'm going, they're not gonna get me. They're just not gonna get me. I'm gonna watch this, I'm gonna come out, I'm gonna go have like a ham sandwich, you know? And it just like didn't, you know, and it got me. But yeah, I think being upfront is crucial, because otherwise people are going to feel jilted. they're going to feel, and they're going to have a negative response to you, your piece, the intention behind it. All you're going to do is build a wall and reinforce whatever wall they already have up around it. Yeah.
I have sort of, I guess, a question with the philosophy at the beginning. So the idea that yourself is sort of an amalgamation of other people's models of you. Do you think that VR in such a high-level simulation might change that sort of social aspect, whereas you don't have real people, or what we think as real people, having a model of you, but you're now interacting with virtual?
Yeah, and in fact, it already has. There are a lot of social VR. Altspace is one of them. VR chat is another one, where you can get in and choose your avatar, and your avatar, your avatar does not have to be same gendered. Your avatar does not have to be even the same size. Your avatar can fly around, or be 10 stories tall, or be a beautiful woman, or be a whatever. And you will meet people in this way as this avatar, and they will form form assumptions about you based on your avatar. The same way that we do in real life, right? Like I said to Christina, my wife and my co-founder, when we left the Airbnb we were staying today, I was like, okay, how did I do with my avatar today? Do I look like a credible avatar? Because it is really similar. Biologically we're born a certain way, but people are hacking that, and in the same way, we're gonna start to see radical shifts in human consciousness based on our ability to interact with each other as simulations. And I think we already are. Like Facebook, I sort of think of as like this giant social simulation. I don't think it's a very good one. I don't think it engenders necessarily kind of healthy behavior, but it's also not full sensory. And I think that there's something about the full sensory experience. You guys were probably in here for the keynote this morning. No? You saw the keynote? And then there was a panel afterwards, and somebody was talking about, well, how do we make rules? And I really am of the belief that the rules will be created and reinforced by the sensory-rich nature of the medium, right? That we trust our sensory experience implicitly. And because of that, we're going to be able to accurately decipher experiences inside VR in a way that we're not when we're watching films, or when we're looking at artwork, or when we're reading a novel. The phrase I use to illustrate this is, we all love to watch a car accident out of our window, right, as a mediated experience. But none of us actually want to be on the corner helping, and because to actually be there implies a certain amount of culpability and a certain amount of responsibility, and it engages that kind of sensory experience naturally engages us on an ethical level. And I think there's actually are you guys all familiar with Nani de la Peña and the work that Emblematic Group does? It's really wild. It's journalism created inside a game engine, usually from source audio. So they take the one experience I saw was the Trayvon Martin a recreation of the night Trayvon Martin was murdered, and it was all of the 911 calls that she took, and she took the tape of it, and then created these little scenes, right, based on the timeline. So you follow, it's all based on evidence, but it's recreated inside the game engine. And you hear people sort of calling and talking, and you feel the amount of time it takes, right? And you kind of see all of the choices that were made on a sensory level, and you just get it in this way that is so much more true than any story you read on the internet, any collection of news clips you see on CNN or anything that any pundit tells you, because you're having the first-person sensory experience of it. And I think that's the real revolution that we're on the cusp of. Yeah.
Not just sort of nitpick, but just sort of with that like, that simulation will be created by someone though. Because this simulation we're all in is essentially someone has created it, and we all agree that we're in the same one. But that simulation is going to be made by one of us. So implicitly, it's already been tuned. So like, even if it's full sensory, like, it's full sensory decided by one person who's going to transmit all that full sensory to you. And even the Trayvon Martin, like the game engine, she can skew the body language and make us feel different things. So do you think that there's going to be like a consortium of people who like, these are the rules of virtual reality, and this is how smell is going to be. This is what chicken that tastes like in virtual reality.
Yeah, I mean, I think when that happens, that's no bueno. Like, I'm not a fan of rules. I'm not a fan of you know, anything that implies enforcement when it comes to artistic expression. I don't agree with the MPAA. I don't agree with game ratings. I think that everybody should be free to decide for themselves and for their families, like, what, you know, content they you know, are exposed to. So that's a bit of a, I understand it's a bit of a radical stance. However, I do sort of, I think that right for like the maybe next 5 years, I think you're right that there will be sort of individual authors kind of like setting up the conversation. But you know, if you look at how the web has really revolutionized the creation and consumption of media, you know, you have citizen journalists now that and citizen journalism on a level that was not possible 30 years ago. And I think that the same way that the web, you know, we've seen on the web, even just in a text-based format, text and photos-based, and then video, you know, you've seen a kind of democratized conversation, right? No longer are, you know, you sort of have this waterfall model of VR creation, or that you just kind of expressed. I don't think that's going to hold for very long, is what I'm saying. I think that eventually these tools will become so democratized that everybody will be able to create their own simulated reality. And you know, if you want to spend the time doing it, you can create an entire sensory-rich experience of your own inner life, and then share that with other people. And so I think that, like, when we get to that level, when there's just so much variety of simulated experience available to us, I think that I don't know. I'm not that worried about kind of control mechanisms. I think that we have to be conscious of that in the same way that, like, on the web, you know, Web 2.0 was definitely way less expressive than Web 1.0. It was more sensory rich but less expressive. I think that, like, we all kind of have a moral obligation to each other to keep expression online, you know, free and open. I actually think that free, uncensored, unblocked expression through the internet is, along with reversing climate change, are the two most critical responsibilities of our generation.
I'm curious, one of your, I guess, I'm just curious what sort of examples you have for how you rewarded disruption.
It's not a VR example, but it's it'll be pretty well known. So there's a show in New York called Sleep No More that they have. It's an immersive theater show. That was my background before I started doing VR. And in the show, you walk into a hotel. It's like in an old hotel, and they've completely redone the place to just be this incredibly sensory-rich environment through which you have total agency of, you know, I mean, there are like security guys at some exits, and at a certain point they start shutting it down and, you know, very expertly kind of allowing people to move themselves, which is really interesting, down to the exit. But in this, they've created this entire world, and it's like furniture and all these things. And if you open any drawer, you'll find a clue. You'll find some artifact, right? And that's the kind of thing with, that's a great example of rewarding disruption, because somebody walks into that environment and they're like, okay, I'm at a theater show, where's my seat? Where am I gonna go sit and watch? And that is that idea or that thought is a real relic of 20th century thinking and storytelling. In the 20th century, we were all spectators, and that's how we defined ourselves. You were a fan of the Beatles, or you were a fan of the Rolling Stones, or you were a fan of this, right? And you wore a Metallica t-shirt because you didn't listen to rap music, you listened to heavy metal, right? But that's changed, and in the 21st century, we define ourselves based on our ability to create and participate, and I think that's way cooler. I'm very into that. So, you know, sort of going with this idea, you walk into the show, and instead of waiting to be led to a seat, you just have to kind of figure out what your experience for the next 2 hours in this environment is going to be. And you have options available to you, and you can sort of choose among those available options. And some options are more, you know, like there are performers like walking around with big crowds of people, and you can be like, oh great, I'm going to go join that big crowd of people. Or you can just start digging through desk drawers, right? Either way, you're going to have a rewarding experience. And I think that it's really crucial that we reward the people who aren't following the parade necessarily, you know, who are going in and just spending 2 hours going through the desk drawers, you know. Put really great stuff in there, you know. Like Nick was saying, it's about, you know, it's an Easter egg hunt or whatever. It's not an Easter egg hunt. That said, you know, what happens when your audience turns around? Did they get another part of the story? Did they get something that they don't maybe necessarily need, but that is pleasant and pleasurable? And, you know, I mean, these are interesting things to think about.